The vultures found her first. Josiah Cade saw them circling from 2 miles out, a slow black wheel turning against a sky so white with heat that looking at it too long made your eyes water. He had been riding the Jornada del Muerto for 3 days, pushing a string of 6 horses north from Las Cruces to a ranch outside Socorro. And in those 3 days, he had seen nothing alive except lizards and 1 rattlesnake that had been too hot to strike. The vultures meant something was dying. In the Jornada, that could be anything. A horse, a mule, a man who had wandered off the trail and run out of water. Josiah had found all 3 on previous crossings, and he had buried 2 of them and left the horse for the birds because you can't dig a grave big enough for a horse with a camp shovel. He turned his horse toward the circling birds because that was the kind of man he was. Not brave, not heroic, just unable to ride past something suffering without looking at it first. The wagon sat at the edge of the trail where the alkali flat met a shallow arroyo. It was a ranch supply wagon, the kind used to haul feed and fencing, with 1 wheel broken and the axle cracked and the mule team gone, either cut loose or wandered off to die in the brush. The canvas cover had been torn away and the bed was empty, except for 2 broken water barrels and a coil of rope. The woman was chained to the rear axle. Josiah pulled his horse up and stared. She was sitting in the narrow strip of shade the wagon threw in the late afternoon, her back against the wheel, her ankles bound with rope and her left wrist locked to the axle with an iron chain and a padlock. Her hair was black and matted with alkali dust. Her lips were cracked to bleeding. Her eyes were closed, but she was breathing, shallow and fast, the way people breathe when they are a few hours from not breathing at all. He was off his horse before he finished thinking about it. He pulled his canteen and knelt beside her and said, "I'm going to give you water. Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened. They were dark brown, almost black, and they held something that wasn't fear. It was a measurement. She was looking at him the way a person looks at something that might save them or might kill them. And she had learned not to tell the difference until it was too late. "Slowly," Josiah said. He held the canteen to her lips and tipped it. She drank 3 small swallows and stopped herself, which told him she knew about dehydration and pacing, which told him she had lived in the desert before, which told him she was not some greenhorn traveler who had gotten lost. "Who did this to you?" he asked. She didn't answer. She lifted her left wrist as far as the chain would allow and turned it so the inside faced him. The brand was burned into her skin just below the heel of her palm. 2 parallel horizontal bars, about 1 inch long each, scarred over, but still raised and red at the edges. A cattle brand, burned into a woman's wrist the way you burn a mark into the hide of a steer. Josiah had been a drifter for 9 years. He had worked ranches from Texas to Montana. He had seen men do things to cattle that turned his stomach and things to each other that turned it worse. But he had never seen a human being branded like livestock, and the sight of it made something shift inside his chest, a door opening onto a room he had kept locked for a long time. "Creevy?" the woman said. Her voice was raw, barely a whisper, but the name came out like a knife drawn across stone. Harlan Creevy. Josiah knew the name. Every cattleman in the territory knew the name. Creevy ran the biggest spread south of Socorro, thousands of acres in the Rio Grande Valley, where Mexican families had farmed for generations before the territory changed hands, and men like Creevy arrived with money and lawyers and the kind of authority that comes from being white in a place that used to be brown. He paid his workers in scrip that could only be spent at his company store. He housed them in shacks on his land that he could revoke at any time, and he kept them in debt so deep that leaving was not a legal option. Everyone knew it. Nobody did anything about it because Creevy owned the sheriff and the judge and half the town council in Socorro. He brands them, Josiah said. The ones who try to leave. Luisa's eyes held his. My father tried to take our family to El Paso. Creevy's men caught us on the road. They shot the mule. They put my father in a hole in the ground for 2 weeks, and they brought me to the barn and put the iron on my wrist so everyone would see what happens when you run. And the wagon. I ran again, 3 nights ago. I stole a supply wagon and drove it into the Jornada because I would rather die in the desert than live on that ranch. She looked at the broken wheel. The axle cracked on the 2nd day. I couldn't get the chain off. The mules wandered away. Josiah sat back on his heels. The sun was dropping toward the western mesas, and the temperature was starting to fall from killing heat to merely brutal. He had a decision to make, and he knew it, and the decision terrified him because Josiah Cade had spent 9 years making sure he never had to make a decision like this again. 9 years ago, he had been a different man. He had been a ranch hand in the Texas Hill Country working for a man named Pruitt, who beat his wife and his horses with equal enthusiasm. Josiah had seen the bruises. He had heard the crying through the bunkhouse walls. And he had done nothing because the pay was steady and the work was good, and getting involved in another man's household was not something cowboys did in 1876. Then Pruitt's wife had died. She fell down the stairs, Pruitt said. The doctor agreed because Pruitt paid the doctor. And Josiah had packed his kit that night and ridden away and never stopped riding because he understood that doing nothing was its own kind of violence. And he had been carrying that knowledge like a stone in his chest ever since. Now here was a woman chained to a wagon in the desert with a brand on her wrist, and the universe was asking him the same question it had asked 9 years ago. What are you going to do? He pulled a file from his saddlebag and went to work on the chain. The iron was thick, but the padlock was cheap, the kind a man buys when he doesn't expect anyone to fight it. It took him 20 minutes and 2 broken file blades before the lock gave. The chain fell away from Luisa's wrist and landed in the dust, and she held her arm against her chest and didn't cry because she had used up all her crying a long time ago. He freed her ankles. The rope had cut grooves into her skin, raw and red and crusted with dried blood, and he cleaned them with water from his canteen and wrapped them with strips torn from his spare shirt. He gave her more water, slowly, a few sips at a time. He soaked a cloth and let her press it to her cracked lips and her sunburned face. He gave her dried beef from his pack and watched her eat it in small, careful bites, savoring each one the way people do when they have been hungry long enough to forget what food tastes like. While she ate, he walked the perimeter of the wagon. The tracks told a story. The mule team had pulled loose from a frayed harness, not cut free. That meant whoever chained her here had not meant to come back. They had left her in the Jornada with a broken wagon and no water, and expected the desert to do what they were too careful to do themselves, because a body found dead of thirst in the desert is a tragedy, and a body found with a bullet hole is a murder, and men like Creevy understood the difference. He found a broken water barrel with a 1/4 inch of brown water pooled in the bottom. He found drag marks where Luisa had tried to pull herself close enough to reach it. The chain had been 6 inches too short. Someone had measured it. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I can do whatever I need to do." He put her on the steadiest horse in his string, a bay mare named Dulcie who had the sense to walk smooth and the patience to carry a rider who could barely hold the reins. They rode north through the cooling evening, Josiah leading the string with Luisa in the middle, the Jornada del Muerto stretching behind them like a scar across the earth. They didn't talk much that first night. Luisa slept in the saddle, and Josiah walked beside her horse and held the reins and watched the stars turn overhead and thought about Pruitt's wife, whose name had been Margaret, and whose grave he had never visited, because visiting it would mean admitting what he had allowed to happen by standing still. Somewhere past midnight, Luisa woke and spoke without lifting her head from the mare's neck. She told him about her family, how her grandfather had farmed the same land in the valley for 40 years before the territory changed and men with papers arrived, claiming ownership of soil that had been Salazar soil since before anyone drew a border, how Creevy had offered work in exchange for the right to stay, and the work had become debt, and the debt had become a cage, how her mother had died of fever 2 winters ago, and the company doctor had charged Creevy's price for medicine that arrived 3 days too late, and even the dying became something you owed for. She told him about the other families, the Garcias, whose eldest son had been beaten for refusing to work on a Sunday, the Delgados, whose daughter had been taken to work in Creevy's house and had not been seen since, the old man, Esteban Ruiz, who had walked off into the desert one night rather than wake up on Creevy's land one more morning, and whose body was found a week later by the trail with his hat placed neatly beside him, because even in death he was a man who kept himself in order. Josiah listened. He didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. He just walked beside the horse and held the reins and let the woman talk, because sometimes the only thing a person needs is someone who will hold the reins while they speak. They reached the outskirts of Socorro on the second evening. The town sat in the Rio Grande Valley, where the river bent west around a line of red bluffs, a collection of adobe buildings and wooden storefronts, and a mission church whose bell tower was visible from 5 miles out. It was the last real town before the Jornada if you were heading south, and the first real town after it if you were heading north, and it survived on cattle money, which meant it survived on Creevy's money, which meant it was not a safe place for a woman with Creevy's brand on her wrist. Josiah took Luisa to the mission church. Father Dominguez met them at the side door, a small elderly priest with white hair and hands that trembled with age but not with fear. He looked at Luisa. He looked at the brand. He crossed himself and said, "How many this time?" "This time," Josiah said, "she is not the first. She will not be the last." The priest led them inside, through the cool, dark sanctuary where candles flickered in iron sconces, to a small room behind the altar where a cot and a basin of water waited as if he had been expecting someone. "I have been collecting testimony for 3 years, 12 families, 47 people, all held on Creevy's land by debt they cannot repay, working land that was taken from their parents. 6 of them have been branded. 2 have disappeared entirely." Josiah stood in the doorway of the small room and watched Luisa sit on the cot and press her face into her hands. Not crying, just breathing. Breathing the way someone breathes when they are inside 4 walls for the first time in days, and the walls are not a prison. "Why hasn't anyone done anything?" Josiah asked. Father Dominguez looked at him with the patience of a man who has asked that question every day for 3 years. "Because the sheriff works for Creevy. The judge was appointed by Creevy's friends in Santa Fe. The territorial governor has never set foot south of Albuquerque." He opened a wooden chest beneath his writing desk and pulled out a leather folder thick with papers. "I have the testimony. I have the names. I have the dates and the descriptions and the locations of the graves where Creevy buried the 2 who disappeared. What I do not have is someone willing to carry this to the federal marshal in Santa Fe. That's 200 miles. Yes, through Creevy's territory. For the first 60 miles, Yes. Josiah looked at the leather folder. He looked at Luisa, who had lifted her face from her hands and was watching him with those dark eyes that measured everything. He looked at his own hands, calloused and sun-darkened and scarred from 9 years of working other men's cattle and avoiding other men's problems. He thought about Margaret Pruitt. He thought about the stairs. He thought about 9 years of running from the sound of a woman crying through bunkhouse walls. "I'll take it," he said. He left before dawn. Father Dominguez gave him the leather folder wrapped in oilcloth and a letter of introduction to the federal marshal and a blessing that Josiah didn't believe in but accepted anyway because it seemed to matter to the old man. Luisa met him at the stable door. She was cleaner now, her hair washed, her lips treated with salve, wearing a fresh blouse the priest had found somewhere. She looked like a different woman, except for the brand, which would never look like anything other than what it was. "You could die on that road," she said. "I've been dying on one road or another for 9 years. At least this one goes somewhere." She reached out and took his hand. Her grip was stronger than he expected. She held it for a moment, then let go and stepped back into the doorway of the mission. "My father's name is Alejandro Salazar," she said. "When you come back, find him. Tell him his daughter is waiting." Josiah rode north along the Rio Grande with the leather folder in his saddlebag and the weight in his chest lighter than it had been in almost a decade. The road to Santa Fe was long and the country was rough, and he knew that Creevy would send men after him the moment he found out what was missing from the priest's study. He rode hard for 3 days, sleeping only in 2-hour stretches when the horse needed rest, eating in the saddle, watching the trail behind him, the way a man watches a door he knows will open eventually. The leather folder sat in his saddlebag like a living thing. 47 testimonies written in Father Dominguez's careful hand, each one a life compressed onto paper, each one evidence of something the territory had decided not to see. On the second night, 2 riders appeared on the trail behind him, pushing their horses fast in the moonlight. They were Creevy's men. He could tell by the way they rode, hard and careless, the way men ride when they believe the territory belongs to them, and the trail is just another piece of property. Josiah left the trail and cut through a canyon he knew from a previous cattle drive, a narrow passage where 2 men couldn't ride abreast and the walls rose high enough to block the moonlight. He waited at the far end with his rifle across his saddle and watched the riders enter the canyon, and then turn back when they realized the passage was too narrow, to chase a man who didn't want to be caught. He didn't sleep that night. He sat with his back against a boulder and the rifle across his knees and listened to the desert. Coyotes called from the mesas. A night bird crossed the stars. The leather folder pressed against his leg through the saddlebag, and he thought about the 47 names inside it and how each one of those names belonged to a person who had trusted a priest to write their story down, and now trusted a stranger to carry it somewhere it mattered. On the 4th day, he reached Albuquerque and sent a telegraph to the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe. On the 5th day, the marshal's deputy met him on the road with 4 men and took the leather folder and read Father Dominguez's letter and looked at the testimony of 47 people and said, "We've been waiting for this." It took 3 weeks. Federal marshals rode south to Socorro with warrants. Creevy was arrested on his own porch, still wearing his silver-handled revolver, still believing that the law in the territory was something he owned. The families on his ranch were freed from their debts by a territorial judge who had been sent from Santa Fe specifically because the local judge could not be trusted. The branding iron was found in Creevy's barn, still hanging on a hook next to the ones he used for cattle, and it was entered into evidence at a trial that lasted 4 days and ended with a sentence of 20 years in the territorial prison. Josiah rode back to Socorro on a morning in late spring when the Rio Grande was running high with snowmelt from the mountains, and the cottonwoods along the bank were green in a way that made the whole valley look like it was breathing. He found the mission church and Father Dominguez sweeping the steps with a broom that was older than he was. "She's in the garden," the priest said. Luisa was kneeling in a small plot behind the church, planting seeds in rows she had marked with string and wooden stakes. Her hair was clean and braided. Her sleeves were rolled up, and the brand on her wrist was visible in the sunlight, not hidden, not covered, not ashamed. She looked up at him. The same dark eyes, the same measurement, but something else now too, something that hadn't been there on the day he found her chained to a wagon in the desert. Trust. "My father?" she asked. "Free, all of them. Creevy's in prison." She stood up. Her hands were covered in garden soil, dark and rich, the opposite of the alkali dust that had covered them when he found her. She looked at him for a long time, and then she did something that surprised them both. She smiled. It was small and careful, and it broke across her face the way water breaks through a crack in dry earth, slow at first and then all at once. "I'm planting tomatoes," she said. "Father Dominguez says they won't grow in this soil. I told him my grandmother grew tomatoes in worse." Josiah looked at the garden. He looked at the mission. He looked at the town of Socorro spread along the river, a town that was starting over, a town that was learning what it looked like when the person holding the power was no longer the person who deserved it. "I don't know anything about tomatoes," he said. "Then I'll teach you." He sat down in the dirt beside her and picked up a seed. It was small and flat and dry, and it didn't look like much. But Luisa showed him where to place it and how deep to push it and how to cover it with soil and pat it down the way her grandmother had taught her. And Josiah did what she said because he had spent 9 years avoiding the simple act of being useful to someone, and he was tired of running. The sun moved across the sky above the mission church. The bell in the tower caught the light and held it. The Rio Grande ran south through the valley, carrying snowmelt and cottonwood seeds and the slow, steady promise that things grow back. And in a small garden behind a church in New Mexico territory, a man who had been drifting and a woman who had been chained knelt together in the dirt and planted something that neither of them could name, but both of them could feel. It was not a garden. It was a beginning.